Our next discussion is going to be about China. You can't have an energy security conference and not talk about China. As principal of Trilogy Advisors, our next speaker specializes in government affairs, political communications, geopolitical risk management. He's a longtime advisor to the State Department. He tells me he's a New Yorker who lives in Washington. So he thought it was important to clarify he's a New Yorker living in Washington. So speaking on China's threat to U.S. national security, please welcome Mr. John Stilitides.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Maynard, for the kind introduction. And a special thank you to Harold Hamm for his invitation to address this audience of very distinguished men and women and leaders in the energy industry. I've been asked, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about a very difficult issue, one that is somewhat uncomfortable for us as Americans to contend with. But as Mr. Hamm reminded me, data over dogma. And we're going to try to focus on that this morning when we talk about the Chinese threat to the United States in various dimensions, but especially geopolitics and energy. One caveat, ladies and gentlemen, you may note from the bio that the State Department is a client of my firm since 2006. However, I'm here in a purely personal, private, and individual capacity. In no way does anything that I say here today represent Biden administration or State Department policy. And so I intend to be very blunt and undiplomatic about some of the issues that we face today. With that, ladies and gentlemen, what I prepared for you is what I hope you will find to be a visually dynamic, simplified, generalized briefing on some of the issues that we are contending with here today. There's a lot to unpack. Our time is tight, so let's get started right away. I like to begin, ladies and gentlemen, with this snapshot. It's a satellite photo of planet Earth, and especially here in Oklahoma, we might forget, as terrestrial human beings, that 70% of the Earth's surface is comprised of oceans, waterways, and seas. And on that 70% of the Earth's surface, we have 90% of global commerce moving around the world every year, and about 80% of oil and liquefied natural gas that powers economies worldwide and literally lubricates markets in a way that has given us the most tremendous prosperity known in the history of humanity. I might posit that today is the greatest time, September 25th, 2023, to be alive as a human being, at least from a material and physical prosperity perspective. I'll leave spiritual well-being for another discussion. But this is a system that has been led, or maybe I would say inherited from the British Empire, but led by the United States since World War II, and especially consolidated with the end of the Cold War over the last 30 years. And it is a free and open shipping system, this international rules-based liberal order that we've been talking about that is under threat, especially from China, to a lesser degree from Russia, that is the underpinning of the global economy that, again, grants us the prosperity that we enjoy today. And it is under threat, ladies and gentlemen, from the country that I would posit is the second greatest beneficiary of this system, besides the United States, and that's the People's Republic of China, led by the Communist Party of China. And we will talk about the Communist Party frequently because every transaction that involves China, directly or indirectly, must go through, it must pass through the filter of the Chinese Communist Party's absolute intention to retain a grip on power of every dimension of China's society, economy, and government. You cannot do business with China without recognizing that central fact. So in 2001, when the United States, in what one might in retrospect consider a colossal strategic blunder of encouraging and welcoming China to join the World Trade Organization before it was compliant with all the criteria, and before we had a law enforcement mechanism in place to ensure it would not cheat on following those WTO criteria, China had an economy of about $2 trillion in 2001. And now you see here that it's about $20 trillion. So it's an economy that has grown by about 1,000%, an astonishing growth rate over the last 20 years. The US economy was about $10 trillion in 2001. Now we're at about 26, 27 trillion. So 150, 160%. Good, but nothing along the lines of China. And yet, the Communist Party today seeks to undermine and upend the system that has given it this tremendous prosperity. And I would say in many ways, this strategy is being led by one man right now, Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And I emphasize General Secretary, ladies and gentlemen, because we conferred this title of president on him, which seems to grant him some type of electoral legitimacy. And really, he's the leader of a 90 million member party in China. There is zero democratic legitimacy. He's the Secretary General of the party, and that is his power base. And he is now in his norm-breaking third term as Secretary General of the party, and in many ways taking on a far more ambitious, aggressive, self-confident, perhaps belligerent, some might say hostile approach to foreign policy against almost all of China's neighbors, starting with Taiwan, but also Japan and South Korea and India and almost every country around the South China Sea, certainly against the United States, and in many ways against international norms and systems. And I'd like to lay out for you what I will call the 3 T's for the sake of our discussion this morning, and that's trade, technology, and Taiwan in terms of these areas of Chinese confrontation with the US and the West. And then we'll talk about not what the Chinese are doing to us, but what we're doing to ourselves with our energy policy, undermining our ability to deal with this Chinese confrontation. So, on trade, the Belt Road Initiative, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the most ambitious infrastructure and transportation undertaking in the history of mankind. About $1 trillion that has been directed by Beijing, directly or indirectly, to build highways, bridges, tunnels, railroads, high-speed train, hydroelectric plants, and very importantly, several hundred coal-fired plants all around the world, throughout Asia, then in the Middle East, into Africa, and even, ladies and gentlemen, increasingly in Latin America. And keep in mind, the end of this year, pardon me, we will be commemorating the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, which then, in the early 1800s, was directed towards the European powers to not establish a colonial presence in the Western Hemisphere, while the Communist Party of China is essentially laying out a Chinese Communist Party presence throughout Latin America, Central America, and even in the Caribbean. That's what's taking place right under our noses today. So, Belt Road Initiative, really a way for, very ingenious, I have to give Beijing credit on this, a way to export excess industrial capacity and excess labor capacity from China to markets all around the world. But as Secretary Pompeo, and I don't know if he's here, as he wisely noted during the Trump administration, this really constitutes a form of predatory lending or debt diplomacy to entrap many of these countries in the global South inside of China's web of influence, not just through financing, but also through diplomacy, in order to be able to secure support for China in international organizations. We're going to detail this in a minute, but much of China's investment over the last 10 to 15 years, however solid it remains in the US and in Europe, has been geared towards the global South. 2 reasons. One is that is the preponderant number of countries around the world, scores of countries that in many ways looking back have been somewhat neglected by what I would call the G7 bloc of nations, but also because these are the fastest growing economies in the world. They were before the COVID lockdowns, and we're looking at GDP growth rates of 4, 5, 8% in many of these countries. And so Beijing is looking now to be able to invest and secure its presence and its FDI return rates in the global South, in these areas where the greatest prosperity is anticipated. But what we've also seen is they've been able to use all of these countries' votes in the United Nations and in UN-affiliated international organizations so that Chinese diplomats are now running those international organizations responsible for air travel, for telecommunications, for agriculture. And you all recall what happened with the World Health Organization. In late 2019, when the Chinese government deliberately contaminated the entire world with the SARS COVID virus, right? They shut down internal travel in China and made sure everyone in Wuhan was able to travel around the world so that China alone would not suffer from COVID. The World Health Organization was the first organization to essentially cover up for China, and as a matter of fact, praised Xi Jinping for his great leadership during the initial part of the global pandemic. So we now have the expansion of the BRICS countries, ladies and gentlemen. We saw this summit take place several weeks ago. And in addition to Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS have now been enlarged to include Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And we don't see so much of a formal security alliance or anything along those lines that is a threat to NATO or to any other US security alliances. But what we may see here is an effort by many of these countries who are alarmed by the comprehensive scale and scope of the US financial sanctions regime against Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, wondering to what extent they should remain dependent on the petrodollar and for the US dollar in general for international trade transactions, given that if one of these countries, say for instance an India, falls on the wrong side of US foreign policy, that there may be a financial sanctions regime on them. And so they're looking to establish not so much a de-dollarization program, but alternatives to complete dependence on the dollar. This is played out very smartly on the part of Beijing with the recent stunning announcement in March of this year of rapprochement between regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran in a manner that the US has been unable to achieve after several years, if not decades, of efforts to bring about this type of a larger peace in the Middle East. And so China is filling the vacuum that has been created by the US's sort of confused policies in the Middle East of recent years. And just last week, we saw that Xi Jinping welcomed Bashar al-Assad of Syria in Beijing to announce a China-Syria strategic partnership so that along the lines of BRI, China can play a major role in the reconstruction of Syria that's been racked, of course, by civil war over the last 10 years, and then welcomed the emir from Kuwait as well. So China's influence in the Middle East is broadening and deepening as we speak. So now let's transition from trade over to technology, ladies and gentlemen. And here I'd like to give you sort of two larger Xi Jinping initiatives to be mindful of. And one was announced in 2015, and that is called Made in China 2025. And here, China is looking at maybe 10, 12 of the core technology sectors, the breakthrough technologies that we anticipate in the years and decades to come, and is investing hundreds of billions of dollars to aspire to dominate in many, if not all, of these technologies in the years to come. So what are we looking at here? Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, synthetic biology, aerospace engineering, and the like. Now, there's no guarantee that China will succeed in all of this. But is the effort underway? It has been very intensively for the last 8 years. And that's being coupled, ladies and gentlemen, by China Standards 2035. Now, this was announced in 2019, and the idea here is for China, to the extent that it's able to dominate several or many of these technologies that we just laid out, is going to determine the standards for global interoperability of many of these frontier or breakthrough technologies. So just as the US, along with our allies in Japan and Germany and South Korea, really have set the standards, the norms, the values, the platforms for technology interoperability that has given us this great prosperity we enjoy today, China is looking to set the norms and platforms and standards and values for global interoperability for the remainder of this century, which will be a technological century as opposed to an industrial century of the 20th century. So, what does that mean for us? Well, let's move away from data and facts for a second and just think philosophically about what this means as men and women, ladies and gentlemen, and as American citizens. The system that we enjoy today is based on freedom and openness and innovation and dynamism. That is really the underpinning of the way we enjoy life in the West and seek to share with as many of our fellow men and women around the world. That's the world that we enjoy today. But if China is able to determine the global interoperability standards for the remainder of this century, think about a system that is based on a closed, repressive, techno-authoritarian, surveillance system that will strip away any privacy and any individual dignity of any individual, of any citizen that lives under such a regime. And China is looking to export its model to as many of these countries in the global south as possible. So what kind of a world do we seek to bequeath to our children and our grandchildren? So China Standards 2035 really is about the direction of the world in the decades ahead. And now we'll close on the China section on Taiwan, ladies and gentlemen. And this map here will refresh your memory on what took place in August of last year when then Speaker Pelosi traveled to Taiwan. We all heard about the furious volley of rockets and missiles flying around and over Taiwan. Made for great, vivid, scary video. But what I think is more important, ladies and gentlemen, and what was lost in the video, is the essential naval blockade planning that China was able to demonstrate with its exercises around Taiwan. And, you know, there's much talk about whether or not China is considering an invasion of Taiwan, and I will leave that to the military experts to best forecast. But what may be more realistic is a Chinese naval and air blockade of Taiwan, and essentially defying the United States with Japan, with any other country, to break that blockade. And is the US militarily capable of breaking a blockade today or in the near future? It's an open question. But I will posit that there are several reasons why Taiwan is so important for the United States, ladies and gentlemen, and maybe our national leaders owe us a good speech, which they haven't really done on Ukraine, if we're frank, and maybe they owe us a good speech on why Taiwan is going to be such an important issue in the years to come. First of all, of course, going back to Made in China 2025, Taiwan, especially TSMC, right, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, is the world's leader in the most advanced semiconductors that we require for the most advanced technologies, not only for satellite technology and military hardware, but also for the advances that we're seeking in quantum computing and artificial intelligence and robotics and the like. Well, whoever controls the Taiwanese economy effectively controls the global advanced semiconductor economy, and the US economy is utterly dependent on free and open access to Taiwan's products. Now, if this is absorbed or annexed or conquered by the People's Republic of China, then Beijing effectively controls our ability to grow our economy or to sustain it. That's capitulation to China, which is unacceptable. Let me offer two other things, if I might, about why Taiwan is so important. One is from a purely political perspective. The Chinese Communist Party will explain to the Chinese people the reason that it is the sole legitimate power, absolute grip, monopoly power in China, no dissent is allowed, is because China is a vast, complex nation today, the inheritor of a great 5,000-year-old civilization, but so complex, so vast, and so beset by problems throughout the Asian continent that only the Communist Party is able to effectively manage and govern this country. Well, in Taiwan, we have a free market, democratic, capitalist system. And so the ethnic kin of the Chinese people trapped in communist China look to Taiwan and see that you don't need the Communist Party to run a Chinese nation. Taiwan is a perfect example of that. So this is a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's hold in China, and therefore the CCP will seek to smother Taiwan's free market democratic system. It has to be eliminated as a threat to the CCP legitimacy on hold. And lastly, I would say, ladies and gentlemen, an important situation here is China's ability to project power beyond the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China feels very much constrained by a pronounced US military presence in Japan and in South Korea, defense cooperation and basing in the Philippines, freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, which, by the way, China is now claiming complete sovereignty over international waterways that maybe comprises 1/3 of the world's commerce every year that passes through the South China Sea. About 10 to 15% of untapped oil and natural gas reserves lie beneath the South China Sea. And China is looking to see how it is able to project its power beyond what it feels is its artificially constrained current posture. And it's trying to do this through what we call anti-access area denial. The Chinese military, ladies and gentlemen, is extraordinarily capable. It hasn't fought a major war in several decades, and we'll talk about the military in greater detail in a minute. But they have developed a missile system that is extraordinarily accurate at long distances, 1,500 to 2,000 miles. And the idea is essentially to be able to keep the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy and Air Force at bay at a great distance in order to render it unable to come to Taiwan's defense, or Japan's defense, or South Korea's defense, or the Philippines' defense. And the extent to which we are able to dissuade and deter China from adopting this policy is going to be one of the great military contests in the region in the years to come. So this graph here gives you a sense of the astonishing growth rate of Chinese military spending over the last 30 years. Largely enriched through our welcoming China into the World Trade Organization, right? You see where it takes off after 2000, just a meteoric rise in defense spending, maybe as much as 900% over the last 30 years. And without trying to draw too sharp an analogy, maybe the fastest growth rate of any military since 1930s Germany. This is what we're seeing in China over the last 3 decades. And I personally will express my concern about America's ability to compete with China in terms of military posture in the years to come, because our debt crisis, this is a real crisis, not the so-called climate crisis. A real crisis here is in terms of debt. It seems as if that we're about to strike about $650 to $660 billion in federal debt service this year, and maybe exceeding $730 to $740 billion next year. But what's more ominous is by 2027, we are looking, now that we probably will have high interest rates for the medium term, $1 trillion a year in debt service. Well, my own sense is that Social Security and Medicare will remain sacrosanct in Washington, D.C., Democrats and Republicans alike. So we're going to have to go after discretionary spending, and the largest chunk of that is defense spending. So I don't know to what extent we can actually build up the military to the degree that we need to deal with this very intensive competition from China. All right, so let's put the China part aside for a second and talk a little bit about what we're doing through our own self-imposed, I would say, reckless policies on energy independence in the United States. So we see here that the inflation rate for gasoline increased vastly far before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, due largely to the signals that the administration gave from day one, closing the Keystone XL pipeline and making very clear at least a rhetorical war on oil and natural gas in the United States, as well as several $1 trillion of unnecessary cash that was dumped on the American economy, having little to do with COVID relief. This is in early 2021, and more to do with taking care of certain constituencies within the Democratic Party. Now, this inflation is causing tremendous pain, ladies and gentlemen, for everyday Americans. If you talk to people outside of Washington, D.C., and New York, and L.A., and San Francisco, you see that there is great pain for a growing number of Americans who are having a difficult time taking care of gasoline bills. And as you all know, you're in the industry, that energy really underpins every other aspect of the economy. I mean, nothing moves in America or anywhere in the world without energy. And so we see the multiplier effects in a very deleterious manner to the average American family, to the average American citizen, from these dangerous energy policies emanating from Washington currently. Just last week, or maybe 10 days or so ago, we learned that we are going to see the cancellation of all leases from the Trump administration for oil and natural gas in the Arctic Natural Wildlife Refuge, and also the announcement that they are proposing to shut down, I think, about 13 million square miles of the National Petroleum Reserve, also in Alaska's Arctic region. Now, I will compound this, I think, sort of reckless description, or the description of reckless policies, by what has been happening with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is meant to address a genuine crisis, whether there is a war, whether there is a natural disaster and a shutdown of refineries or other energy-related infrastructure. But instead, it's been drawn down in recent years to make sure that gasoline drops by 15 or 20 cents a gallon. And it's a very precarious balance that the White House is looking to manage here between a radical environmentalist constituency, and the need to address everyday Americans' concerns about gasoline inflation. But this is not the reason to have a strategic petroleum reserve. And while we're doing this here in the United States, China has been importing far more excessive oil from Russia than it has been refining and exporting, which tells us that they're filling their oil reserves while we're depleting ours. A backwards policy, one might say. Now, Senator Lankford, I don't know if he's here today, but he spoke last night at the reception, and he spoke about this graph, ladies and gentlemen, which I'm pleased to have included when I heard him mention that last night. This is the Biden administration's own forecast out of the Energy Department, showing very clearly that petroleum and natural gas will constitute the overwhelming preponderance of energy consumption in the United States in 2050. About 40% oil, 35% natural gas. We will still have nuclear and hydropower. And yes, the green line there demonstrates a possible increase in the use of solar and wind electricity to meet increasing energy demands. But the Biden administration is telling the country and the world that oil and natural gas will be with us in very dominant ways for the next 25 plus years. Yet we don't really hear much about this in the larger debates about energy policy. And even since the Kyoto Climate Accord in the mid-1990s, and certainly with Paris in 2015, and all of these discussions about how to deal with climate concerns, we have seen a significant increase in the use of coal and natural gas and oil around the world on an almost steady upward forward trajectory, except perhaps for the 2008 financial crisis and certainly the forced lockdowns in 2020 and 2021. And Russia, ladies and gentlemen, is looking to see how it maintains global market share by exploiting another area of untapped oil and natural gas reserves beneath the Arctic Ocean. And they're moving very aggressively to be able to extract oil and natural gas to maintain market share, especially against the United States, which is now the world's leading oil producer, and Saudi Arabia. And of course, there's a very interesting dynamic between Russia and Saudi Arabia inside of OPEC Plus on controlling oil prices. And this is in stark contrast, of course, to the slide that I showed you a few minutes ago about what we're doing in our Arctic region, completely the opposite of what Russia is doing. And Russia is completing its second Power of Siberia pipeline and is desperate to have Xi Jinping sign on to connecting this Power of Siberia pipeline from their joint LNG facilities in the Arctic region here in the Yamal Peninsula. There's already a Power of Siberia 1 that delivers gas to China. And now Putin is looking to finish this by the end of the year, Power of Siberia 2, through Mongolia into China. There is still no agreement, but this is probably Putin's #1 project in working with China on their combined energy projects. And China is a 30% investor in Yamal, so China is now deeming itself an Arctic energy power through its partnership with Russia in at least this initial project. So let's try to bring this into a larger context, ladies and gentlemen, because we keep hearing about this phrase, energy transition. And I will tell you, in my very humble opinion, there's no such thing as an energy transition if we're honest, right? Going back to Mr. Ham's admonition that we use data over dogma. There is no energy transition. This is a graphic of world energy use over the last 200 years. And as was referenced last night by Secretary Pompeo and Mr. Ham, 800 million to 1 billion people still use wood and animal dung, animal manure, to cook their food and to heat their homes. On top of that, once coal became commercially available and scalable in the 19th century, we see coal being introduced into the global energy mix. Once that happened with oil, starting in the late 1800s and especially the early 1900s, oil added on top of coal and biomass. Now, of course, natural gas. There are these slender slivers here of nuclear and hydropower and solar and wind electricity on top of that, but there is no displacement, ladies and gentlemen, of oil, natural gas, or coal for that matter. Coal, we can thank China, right? Because China produces 52% of global coal supply every year. The second place country, India, is at 9%. So you see how China is the coal superpower of the world, even if they hide behind clean energy in much of their propaganda. And so this is actually what is happening around the world today and for the foreseeable future, ladies and gentlemen. There is no energy transition. There is energy addition, there is energy diversification, but there is no energy transition that is taking place. And these bars over here will give you a little bit more of a graphic perspective, ladies and gentlemen, because after 4 decades of $4 trillion of investments in solar and wind electricity, you see here this yellow bar down here. About 40 years ago, maybe 5% of global energy consumption was based on solar and wind. And yes, after $4 trillion and 4 decades, there is maybe a quadrupling of solar and wind electricity to maybe 15, 16%. And I think it was Dr. Sen last night who was saying that coal, oil, gas, and perhaps nuclear have consistently comprised about 80 to 85% of global energy production. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen, right? Stark facts, stark data. And we don't see any rocket ship type trajectory on solar and wind. If there's a gradual increase, so be it. But global energy demand will also increase, and hydrocarbons will meet that goal. So those of you who would like a deeper dive here, I have to defer to a brilliant scientist in Alberta by the name of Vaclav Smil, S-M-I-L, who wrote a terrific book, not his most recent one on the importance of size in physics, but a book called How the World Really Works. And he posits that the advanced industrial world of the modern 21st century is utterly dependent on the production, the energy-intensive production of steel, of cement, of plastics, and of ammonia. And without these essential components, we cannot sustain the spectacular quality of life that we enjoy today. And the energy-intensive production of these components utterly requires gas and oil. Solar and wind cannot power 3,000-degree furnaces in the United States, in Germany, or in any other industrial powerhouse. And to be able to provide for feedstock, we need the fertilizers that come from natural gas, or else we will have mass starvation, especially in the global south. So, oil and natural gas, as Alex Epstein will make the effective argument, is actually the moral way to proceed with flourishing for human beings around the world. Okay. So the US has been able to become an oil and natural gas superpower, thank you, Mr. Ham, and horizontal drilling, while at the same time being the world's leader in reducing carbon emissions. So even though we have a number of countries, especially in Europe, who virtue signal their adherence to the Paris Accords, and we have politicians who are issuing rhetoric after rhetoric on the need to adhere to the Paris targets, the US is doing so through sheer technological innovation and market forces. And we are doing this while China, and unfortunately for now India, remain the world's greatest carbon emitters. But we are moving the world in a better, cleaner direction, and we're doing it through technology and through innovation, through what I would call the American way. Now, the Biden administration's so-called Inflation Reduction Act, we can call it whatever we like if we're going to be using truth in advertising, purports to be investing about $350 billion in clean energy, so-called clean energy. And I also question the use of the word clean, because if you look at the sourcing for solar panels and wind turbines, you know what happens around the world, ladies and gentlemen, with slave labor and child labor to obtain the rare earth elements that are required to build solar panels and wind turbines. But again, a different discussion. So the Congressional Budget Office believes that this will be about a $350 billion investment of taxpayer subsidies, for lack of a better phrase. But I don't know if Mr. Solomon is here, but Goldman Sachs predicts that it will actually cost about $1.2 trillion of taxpayer subsidies over the next 10 years to support this IRA green energy subsidy to promote solar and wind and electric vehicles in the United States. And if anyone would like a case study of where this will take a major industrial power in the wrong direction, ladies and gentlemen, look at what's happening in Germany today. The economic motor of the European Union once lauded for its industrial capabilities and its powerful export markets, is now in a process of literal deindustrialization, and its most energy-intensive industries, those factories and facilities that are used to produce ceramics and plastics and glass and steel and cement, as Václav Smil indicated in that graphic earlier today, are closing down because of high energy prices, because Germany led Europe in becoming utterly dependent on a hostile foreign energy supplier. Which strategist came up with this idea? To surrender your energy sovereignty to a hostile power that can use it as leverage against you when there's a disagreement or profound rupture, as there is over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so we're very much concerned about what Germany is doing to itself through this Energiewende adherence to closing down all of its nuclear plants, moving towards solar and wind. Now it's scrambling to build LNG refineries, as we noted last night, the US providing LNG because we're able to export it. But they're actually tearing down wind turbines now in Germany to be able to access lignite coal, the dirtiest form of coal, to provide power capability for their population. And God forbid that there is a normal winter, even worse, a cold winter in Germany, we will see significant impoverishment of the German middle class, and we may see this in other countries like the UK as well. So as I'm closing, ladies and gentlemen, we see what happens when Europe allows itself to become dependent willfully, by determination, on Russia for its oil and natural gas supplies. And Europe has been in a state of semi-panic over the last year and a half, and that will likely continue for the next several years until Europe hopefully is able to achieve some measure of reliable, affordable, secured energy supplies from the United States, countries like Algeria, perhaps in the Middle East and elsewhere. But I'm very concerned about what is happening on the electric vehicle market, ladies and gentlemen, because China, as part of that Made in China 2025 strategy that I elaborated on before, targeted electric vehicles knowing in 2007, 2008, that it would not be able to compete with the United States or Japan or Germany in terms of production of combustible engines, right? So what did they do? They saw where we were starting to take a lot of this debate about climate policy and climate change and the like, and they invested hundreds of billions of dollars into their own domestic electric vehicle manufacturing capability and electric vehicle battery manufacturing so that they utterly dominate the supply chains for electric vehicles down the road. And they are looking now, I believe, to target Germany's global automotive industrial lead, just the way they collapsed Germany's and Europe's solar panel manufacturing in the late noughts and early teens. That's flattened out completely now. And China controls most of the refining and processing of rare earth elements required to build solar panels, required to build wind turbines, as well as electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries. And ladies and gentlemen, one little irony here, one twist. You can't build solar panels and wind turbines without the steel and cement that are energy-intensive industries that require coal, well, coal not so much, hopefully, but oil and natural gas. But this is what we're facing, ladies and gentlemen, today. And the question I ask our colleagues in Washington, D.C. and nationwide in a number of states with questionable energy policies is, why would we follow Europe's strategic blunder of becoming utterly dependent on a hostile authoritarian regime for our energy when the United States is today and should remain the natural gas superpower on the world stage? The United States is today and should remain the world's oil superpower, along with Saudi Arabia and with Russia. And you see here, ladies and gentlemen, this is where in 2019, American energy production finally surpassed American energy consumption for the first time in decades, and we became a genuine energy superpower and a net exporter of natural gas. This is what it means to be energy abundant, to be energy dominant, to be energy independent, to be energy sovereign. So why would we willfully capitulate and surrender to a Chinese economy and to a Chinese design that is looking to undermine American leadership? So my last slide, ladies and gentlemen, is a snapshot from February of this year. Xi Jinping traveled to Moscow to consolidate the no-limitation strategic partnership with Russia. And in leaving, making sure he said this with all of the media in tow, said to Vladimir Putin, Mr. President, the world today is witnessing and experiencing changes, the likes of which we have not seen in more than 100 years, which of course harkens back to the aftermath of World War I. And he said to Vladimir Putin, and you and I are the drivers of these changes. And Vladimir Putin simply agreed. So ladies and gentlemen, the choice really is ours. And I'm for energy sovereignty over energy capitulation. I'm for an end to the kind of colossal strategic blunders that are crippling Europe right in front of our eyes. And I don't want to see that future for any of us, for my 4 sons, or for our children and our grandchildren. The decision really is ours to make. Energy poverty and energy capitulation is a choice. And I believe in energy independence, energy sovereignty, and energy dominance around the world. That's what makes this country the greatest nation on the face of the earth. I thank you very much for your time and your interest. Mr. Ham, thank you again for having me here. And I think we have time for several questions. So thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So John, thank you so much for that. If you have a question, just please raise your hand. We'll get a student ambassador to bring over a microphone. I think we do have maybe 5 minutes-ish for some Q&A. John, maybe I could start with one,
Sure.
Which is a number of us are aware of what is going on in Germany. And your graph is stark. Like what's happening there is terrible. Why are we not watching this data? And because we're all seeing it, why are we not realizing we can't go that direction? Like the data's on the screen. This is not a mystery. One of our friends has made some terrible choices. Why can't we course correct?
Well, this is a larger political debate in the United States. And in many ways, we're playing catch up to our ideological adversaries. They have framed this in moral terms through indoctrination, especially of our children. I have spent the last 20 years talking to my children at the dinner table when they come home from school in McLean, Virginia, and trying to educate them as to what is accurate as opposed to what is inaccurate about what is being taught. But we're playing catch up. And I think to a large degree, and I want to be as respectful here to the oil and gas and larger energy industry as possible, you're all focused on doing well and succeeding and delivering the benefits of energy to the world, to America and to the world. Our adversaries have a very different agenda. They are looking to promote global wealth redistribution. They are looking, I think, and I hate to say this, but I have to be honest here, essentially to de-develop the West. There's almost a guilt feeling about how we have used the environment to our benefit. And yes, we've made many mistakes in the past, but we keep moving in a positive direction, better use, more responsible use. But we have adversaries, ideological adversaries throughout the West, and the worst part is, Maynard, that our foes in Beijing and Moscow know how to exploit our divisions here and to deepen the divisions and to give not one leg up, but multiple legs up to the other side of the debate.
So I think your point is it's not that they don't understand the chart, they're comfortable with
They
what's happening.
choose to ignore it.
Okay.
Dogma over data on their side.
I think I've got a question back here.
Yep.
You claim that China's trying to de-develop the West, but if they actually did what you claim, China's economy would collapse. Do you really believe that's the goal here, that they're looking to become incredibly poor again? And if so, why are you so fearful of China? Because if they're a poor country, they represent absolutely no threat at all.
Right. So let's clarify the communication. So I appreciate your question. I never said anything about China seeking to de-develop. When I'm talking about ideology, we're talking about what's happening in the United States. Our fellow Americans who are looking to de-develop the United States. China is looking to exploit, not to impoverish the United States, we're their largest export market, but they want to set up a global framework for diplomacy, for military activities, and for economic transactions on their terms. They see themselves as the Middle Kingdom, not the middle of Asia, but literally, if you go back to Chinese history, between the earth and the heavens. They see a special place for themselves, and all of the countries around China are tributary countries. This is all clear in the Chinese history. So they are looking to see how they can bring the United States, certainly in Asia, to its heels, so that China manages Asia's commerce and Asia's economies, and so that the U.S. is no longer a country that artificially constrains China. But on this issue, this is Americans that we're talking about, or our fellow Europeans, who are looking to see how we, out of a guilt trip, out of a sense of adherence to a Marxist view of how wealth redistribution should be taking place around the world, they are promoting, whether willfully or not, the de-development of the West. So not China, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that.
We've got time for one more question over here.
John, following up on your question on the industrialization of China and the deindustrialization of elsewhere, triple the energy consumption in China for manufacturing than in the US. But on the energy production side, we went, as you showed, from the world's largest importer of energy to a net exporter. They went from roughly even, produced as much energy as they consumed 20 years ago, to today by far the world's largest importer of energy. Do you think that's a vulnerability for China?
It very much is, and they're looking to address it in two ways. So one, with the Belt Road Initiative, and I appreciate the opportunity to elaborate on this. They're looking to establish a series of parallel shipping lanes. I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, the free and open shipping system that the US and our allies defend and promote around the world. China is setting up what we call a string of pearls, a number of ports and harbors all along Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Red Sea with Djibouti, and even along the eastern coastline of the African continent, to be able to assure access to oil, natural gas, and natural resources, and certainly for the sale of finished products to affluent markets in Europe and certainly in North America. So, all right, we're out of time. So that's a very important consideration for China in terms of energy independence, so that they're not reliant on the US protected lanes for oil and natural gas from the Middle East, which they absolutely are today. And we're seeing the possibility of additional pipelines, overland pipelines, again, part of Belt Road Initiative, not only through Mongolia into Russia, but also into Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries that are also rich in oil and natural gas. So they're looking to establish energy independence from this US-led free and open shipping system. Why? Perhaps because they may trigger a crisis with the US that leads to a blockade of energy supplies to China, because of China's own initiative against the US and the West.
Thank you, John.
I believe we're done.
We appreciate you.
Thank you all very much. And